right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AO 2019-94, Wildfire Danger Areas. Let's go ahead and start with introductions, starting with John.
John Wellington.
Pete Peterson.
Forrest Dunbar.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Felix Rivera.
Cameron Perez Verdia.
Becky McPherson, Municipal Attorney.
Crystal Kennedy.
All right, I'll go ahead turn it over to Ms. Zolotel to do a quick introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an ordinance giving the fire department through the chief the opportunity to designate wildfire danger areas. This is an S version, and I'll have Dean go through the specific portions of the revised ordinance, but I wanted to say three main things about this. One, it's a tool that relies on the fire department's subject matter expertise. It only applies when there's a burn ban already in effect. Two, it's a public safety ordinance. It is meant to keep people safe. And while it deals with camp and camp abatement, that is really secondary to keeping people safe. And third, I think it's timely, given the summer we had, to provide this tool to the fire department so that even if there is a burn ban effect, if certain areas are extremely dangerous, we can keep people out to preserve life and safety and all the things we want to do. So that, if Dean will walk us through where we're at with the ordinance.
Sure. So I guess I'll walk through the changes in this solution and explain why I'm doing. Let me know if I need to speak up or anything like that. So I'll first change some page 2, some definitions. And these changes, there's a new definition, increased value exposure model, and that term is used in the revised definition to wildfire danger area. So the fire chief, Hedrick, she recommended these changes to wildfire danger area to refer to areas designated as high danger area in accordance with the increased fire exposure model and current use by fire department. That model is a science-based tool. It's got various layers that shows what the scopes of fire fuels, fire behaviors, special response capability in areas that are on the high danger areas in terms of wildfire outbreaks. And so we propose that the science behind these circumstances and incorporate that into the definitions. That's the purpose of doing that, rather than having the original definition that was looking at the circumstances and had some more subjective sort of components to it. Do you have anything to add? Ms. McPherson, you're more involved in the definition recommendation.
No, I think you've summarized it well, and I commend the sponsors. I think and Dean, I think the S version looks great. And I think the intent was, again, when I was working with the fire chief, was to recommend changes that correspond with an objective tool that can actually be applied by the fire department in a way that does not result in the entire municipality being labeled as a fire danger area and thus creating another untenable situation, but actually targeting the areas of highest danger, again, in an objective and science-based way, and then allowing for this new tool to really be something that provides an additional hook to make situations safe for people who are camping and also for others who are interacting with every spaces. So I think Dean summarized it well.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Did you have more?
Well, I was going to run through this ordinance.
Do you want to do it now or wait? Okay, go ahead.
So the next change, well, actually, something that wasn't up that isn't changed. So on page 4, we had added a few tools to contribute to some provisions in our control. And on page 4, middle is the 24-hour notice about all danger abatement. This was added in the original first ordinance, and we're not changing that. The fire chief said that it sounds like a very useful addition to the have, and it meets the objectives that Sarah's now explained in detail. But we are taking out the wildfire danger area in line 36 from 72 hours notice protected land use. And what it is, it sort of existing in that protected land use list. And we also have I guess you can see on page 5 in our current 72 hours notice process. They can be used beyond this wildfire danger area or not. So it would be necessary to add this to our list and some fire areas. In the exchange we had on page 6, we had added sentence in the language regarding an exception to the requirement of posting notice prior to a building process for events. That's when exigent circumstances pose a serious risk to human life and safety. We added including wildfire danger areas, village and active wildfire vicinity. That authority has already existed in the fire department and fire chief's authority, member state statute, and the international fire code adopted in all countries. It's not necessary to secure there were some concerns expressed that expressly stating that here might have some unintended consequences in how it's interpreted. We need to limit like this. When there's wildfire danger area, but circumstances. So it would seem to be that exception worded broadly as it already is. It doesn't change anything in terms of the fire chief's authority to require abatement or the fire police chief's authority to require abatement in exigent circumstances, wildfire or otherwise. The next change is to subsection 17 at line 13 on page 6. It correlates to complete deletion of section 3 of the ordinance. It starts at the bottom at line 40 on page 6. So that new section was to allow summary abatement of fire remains and heating devices by extinguishment of any flame or fire, and the removal of safety from the fire remains and heating devices. And I think in general, in talking to the fire chief and members of the administration, there's practical issues trying to implement that authority. And so I guess the general idea is it's not really quite right for us to have that in place yet until we have a process for removing the hazardous materials. We're talking about propane tanks, removals for fire, and because we're a government entity, we protect our employees, we have OSHA regulations and so forth, we need to have a hazmat type of transport vehicle and storage facilities. And we don't have that in place now, especially for immediate removal. So I think that we need more time before that proposal is adopted, and that might come out at some point in the future. And so in page 6, it's subsection 17. It's still in place, it's revised to retain what was in that new section in terms of the fire chief being able to declare a wildfire danger area close to the public. And allow trails to remain open at least for non-organized transportation to the closed area. And closing an area to public use would, in exigent circumstances, still relates back to the exception to prior notice of campsites. We have immediate removal of campsites if an area is closed as well as transitioning from there. So that's, I think, all the changes to this ordinance.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's about this section that I wanted to talk about and ask a question on page 6, this new subsection 17. So, starting on line 17, it says, when there is a burn ban in effect, the fire chief or designee may declare wildfire danger areas closed to public use. And then when closed to public use, exigent circumstances are presumptively exist, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a broader power than I realized that we were giving or perhaps reaffirming in this ordinance. Because I thought it was, you designate a wildfire area, and then if they use any kind of fire implement, we could immediately seize, we could immediately abate that camp. But what I'm reading here is they close off an area, and then they're saying, that's it, you can't go in there. It doesn't matter if you have fire implements or not. And that is a pretty extreme, not extreme, that's a pretty significant power. And again, the fire chief, as we talked about last week, it's really difficult to say, okay, Valley of the Moon Park is a wildfire danger area, but Russian Jack Park isn't. I mean, the whole municipality is hot and dry. So they could either declare a huge chunk of the municipality, or they could declare all of the spots where homeless folks usually are camping to be wildfire danger areas. And then it doesn't matter if they have fire implements or not. Under this reading, it sounds like they can immediately be abated. Is that right?
Can I comment on that, or would you want to?
Well, I can say that the intent is twofold. One, the wildfire danger area is supposed to be clear. It's just dangerous to be, period. So, yes, we want to keep people out. And two, and I think Becky will talk a little bit about this, but we tied it to the scientific tool, so it can't be just what you said, where it's everywhere. So she can maybe explain a little bit more. I wish the chief would have been
I
able
know,
to join
I
us.
can put on my fire chief hat and pretend to be the fire chief for a moment. And when we were looking for was a tool that actually isn't sort of the whole municipality, but is, so the question that we posed to her was kind of, is there such a tool, or is this automatically going to be the whole municipality? And there is such a tool, and that is this fire exposure model, and it looks at different types of fuel that are available. So one of the things she mentioned are that, like, for instance, Russian Jack Park has a number of felled trees from previous wind events that have yet to be cleared out. So the level of, like, accumulated debris vegetation in that park means that that park, large portions of that park, would fall into these high danger areas under the fire exposure model, and so it wouldn't be the whole municipality. It actually is this model actually gives the capability to pinpoint certain locations. And the way I understood this to be crafted, the vision was that in this instance, so we have a burn ban, and then the fire exposure model pinpoints these certain high danger areas. Those areas would be eligible for 24-hour abatement, and after they abated, practically speaking, we would do what we did on the park strip when that camp was removed. We remove the camp, and then we post the area with signs and say this area is now closed to the public, and anyone who subsequently entered once that posting was in could be abated with an hour's notice, because the idea is people shouldn't be camping in these areas at this point with this amount of fuel buildup.
So can I ask a follow-up then?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, doesn't matter if they were using fire implements or not. But you're saying closed to public use. So if you were to close, for example, what you just described, you couldn't walk onto the park strip. Forget camp. And if you were to close Russian Jack Park, there are tons of social trails people jog on, people ride their bikes on. They would also be violating this ordinance.
So the way it says develop trails may remain open for non-motorized transportation here. I do think that there's probably potentially some room for discussion there of what is and isn't a developed trail. But my understanding, I don't want to speak for the sponsor, is the vision is that trails would remain open, but that, and you're right, that people wouldn't be able, I think the park strip is an inapposite example, because the nature of the vegetation on the park strip is that it will never actually fall into this model unless we start piling wood on it or something. I mean, it's an open grassy area, it isn't going to meet this. Absent substantial changes in the vegetation there, it won't meet this. Russian Jack Park is a good example, and my understanding is the trails would remain open, but all other use of the vegetated area that is declared not open to public use would be restricted.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm hung up on this sentence from 17 and 18. May declare wildfire danger areas closed to public use. I mean, that is a, again, that's a broader statement than I thought, than I perceived what we were doing.
Okay. And I will defer to the people here.
If I may add, that sentence has very advantage in this questionnaire. This sort of acknowledges the fire chief has this discussion already from the state statute and from our international fire code. In an emergency to close areas to the public and evacuate, that's already in that language. Putting it in here at least allows the fire chief to do that in the public use in this sort of context. But it's a very high standard that the chief needs to, I guess, need to consider an emergency actually exists close to the area. And here we're saying, well, burn ban and wildfire danger area, you want the chief to take a close look at whether the circumstances will also justify exercising that.
And so, again, am I misunderstanding that? I thought that the use of actually starting a fire or using fire implements was a trigger for at least a portion of this. But it seems like that's not the case, that it's a status crime. It's not a crime, but you are here, doesn't matter what your behavior is, you are in this space, therefore you are subject.
Well, I think, I think that the part has been removed that says that, that this portion here at the end, that sure that we based on a trigger of use of implements recklessly that involved seizure of the actual implements.
Yeah.
That piece has been deleted at this point, as Dean described, for further kind of workshopping and consideration before that concept comes back. And this isn't, I think this is simply saying that there are areas that we can, the code already recognizes that we could sign certain areas as specifically closed for trespassing and then move campers along with an hour's notice. And this is basically recognizing that in this specific instance, that's what we're going to do with these areas. And the idea, as Ms. Alice already spoke to, is that it's for the safety of the campers in these specific areas, because if they're sleeping somewhere or potentially otherwise not paying attention to, evacuating when there's a fire event, these are the areas where that could be immediately deadly. And so it's not it's simply saying for this limited amount of time, because of this pressing identified scientifically based safety issue, we're going to post these areas and then move people along with an hour's notice. And likely they'll camp somewhere else, but it will be in a place where we've determined that the danger to them is lower.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Weddleton.
Following up on that, interesting perspective. So the perspective here is we want to help the homeless by not letting them be somewhere where they'll get injured by fire. And I came at it from a very different viewpoint, is that we have neighborhoods worried about burning down. This goes the opposite way. This takes places that would most likely be likely to burn are the places we don't use as much, like the place near where the MLK fire was. It's not as actively used. But places like near Valley of the Moon, it's fairly clear. The trees are cleared because neighbors have gone in there and cleared it, because campers over the last decade have cut down a lot of trees. So when they get kicked out of the less used areas, they're going to go somewhere. They're going to move even more densely into the Moon area, places like that, where we're having the most pushback. So they can still start fires, do everything like they do now, but they'll be more dense. They'll be closer to neighbors. We will enhance the problem that we're getting complaints about through this.
I would defer to the sponsor to talk about intent, but I think that the challenge, I think what again, what the fire chief and I talked about when she was weighing in on this was the importance of tying this to a science-based standard that actually concerns whether or not fires will spread when they're started. And I think we had some concern about essentially it becoming a tool to target people who were near the loudest complainers. And that is much harder, imposing a 24-hour abatement process really needs to be justified by something more than the concern of the neighbors in order to, again, to take this adage when we look at kind of a due process balancing test. A court would ask us to look at kind of what is the pressing issue that allows us to take more expedited action against an individual, and shorten the amount of time they have for notice and opportunity to be heard before being moved off of where they are camping. And I think here the justification is an objective science-based criteria that concerns safety, and that's what legally I was concerned about when talking with the fire chief about it. I defer to the sponsors to talk about intent of the ordinance and what we're trying to do, but like from where I sit legally, it was important to me that it was tied to something that would concern safety, that was objectively measured, and not simply, this person is upset that there's a camp near her house and she thinks it's fire danger, when maybe it isn't. Maybe there's actually nothing near that fire that would ever catch in such a way that would transfer the fire to a neighborhood. But it just happens to be visible. I think it's important, again, to tie it to something that concerns fire science.
And to add on to that, one of the versions of this did have a proximity-based model in it, but the fire chief convinced us that that wasn't the right way to go, that we should do something that's based on proximity to buildings and structures, that instead this model, the Anchorage Fire Exposure Model, is the best way for the fire chief to determine which are the areas that we should declare as the wildfire danger areas. And I think it still gets to the intent that we were looking at originally, and which you're stating, which is public safety for everyone, for the people in the camps and for the people out of the camps. Yes, go ahead, Sadie.
Brent, really just to bounce off what Felix said, I really wanted to just emphasize that
places that would be closed off to public use or places that are just really dangerous for anyone to be in. It doesn't matter if you're camping. It means if you're walking through and you have a lighter in your pocket that you decide to light because someone wants to light a cigarette, and then sparks fly off and that starts a fire. Or someone's, I know this is illegal, but if people will go into public spaces and try and have light joints secretly, and those people, if they go into places like this, they can start a really dangerous fire and put a lot of people in danger. So these are areas that would be closed off to public use are going to be just extremely dangerous for people to be in, regardless if they're camping or not.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, I want to get back to what John was saying, though, and also here again, and I apologize if I didn't observe it the first time, why the other section that had to do with use of fire implements was removed. Because it does seem like, you've got these two different circumstances. You've got places that, let's say it's in the middle of the Campbell Tract or the middle of, another very large park, pretty deep in the woods. And we know there's a lot of down trees there and it's a dangerous area. But it's also the case that there aren't people camping that deep, or if they are, we get them out of there and they go to Valley of the Moon Park, or they go to wherever. And then they're in an area that isn't a high fire danger area, but they're using fire implements. I mean, isn't that the other way to come at this? So you would have the one set where you have these really dangerous areas, and then you could say, and there it's like you can't be in there regardless. And then there are these other areas that aren't quite as dangerous, but if you start using a propane bottle or start using a stove, then you have increased the risk and the perceived risk. And I don't think it's totally illegitimate to say a fire here is a little bit less likely, but it's also be much more costly in terms of the human cost of burning down a neighborhood. I mean, it's similar to when we do wildfires. We let the wildfires burn out in the middle of nowhere because it's a natural process. It's fine. But if it came anywhere near a town, we went and stopped it. And so it seems like the fire-making devices would be a way to stop the folks that are in maybe a lower danger area but are actively starting their own fires. So why, can you say why you removed that other prong of this?
Go ahead, Dean, and then I can speak to it too.
I'll try my best to explain that. One, I think that we're not prepared to implement that section. One reason why is this requires some superficial action rather than firefighters can go, they'll extinguish a fire, they'll do that. That's one of some of the steps here. Second step is removal of fire implements that you're talking about. And fire department doesn't do that. They cannot seize property and move it, only police can do that. So it requires police to also respond to the site where behaviors observed, someone having fire or fire implements. And when police get there, they remove it, they identify all these principal requirements for removing fire implements. Plus, if they're just removing firewood or a propane tank, the general view is, well, does that really solve the problem? They might solve it for a short period of time, but many of these people who are using recreationally cooking fires for their hungry are simply going to go find more firewood or steal another propane tank, get another lighter. These are things that they can obtain rather easily up from someone's back deck across just a creek rather than part of the folks level. So would this really be effective in terms of achieving the goal? I don't think it's quite there yet, and that's one reason it's removed. But I don't think that the sponsors are dropping this proposal. We've looked at this with Mr. Rivera and Mr. Franks a couple of times, and Mr. Croft as well since last year. And we're just not quite there yet to the sectional provision that I think can be implemented and be effective.
But I thought the idea was that the use of a fire implement would trigger abatement of the entire camp, not just the device.
Yeah, so the original intent was reckless use would trigger summary abatement of the fire implement. But exploring that further, we ran into some significant constitutional issues of how to determine reckless use, and then just practically how this would work. And the practical issues, the fire chief just couldn't think of one example not a single example of where we would actually be able to summarily abate a fire implement, because we would never catch someone in the point of actually recklessly using it, then AFD having to call APD getting on scene, then APD having to see reckless use of it, and then being able to abate it. That would never happen.
Yeah, I appreciate the sponsor, how difficult this is from a constitutional practical perspective, but it does seem like we're kind of tying ourselves in knots here a little bit. And maybe it's just an issue that can't be easily resolved.
And there's another practical point which I wish the chief was here to speak, and maybe you can, as you know, is is sort of the danger of fire implements, and I think that's a really important part to speak to. And the chief had a lot of really good data and just knowledge about the practical danger of these implements. Mr. Weddleton, did you have a question?
Well, it seems like you could define reckless use of a fire incident. If there's a citywide burn ban, that's it. You got something that'll start a fire, or you have a fire. That's reckless, right? I mean, we're all told that we can't have stuff in our yard because it's reckless. You don't do it, so it.
I think that's certainly fair. I think the challenge, again, and we did get kind of tied around, and I think the challenge is that, having been through this with a couple other members of the body who have sponsored past or tried to contemplated past ordinances around this, I think it is just sticky. It's complicated because, practically speaking, my understanding from the chief, again with gesture for the chief chair, is that the majority of these fires are wood fires, so there isn't really anything to seize, practically speaking. And there is some question of wood fires near propane tanks, like, is that a danger? But if the propane tank isn't being used recklessly and it's the wood fire, so it's sticky, and I think the idea is that it's being tabled now for further discussion.
If you had an ongoing wood fire, and we know that your presence there living with the wood fire is a real public safety danger, do you really think it would stand up to constitutional scrutiny to abate the camp, the whole camp, not just the fire? Don't just pick up the firewood, you abate the camp, because they started a wood fire during a burn ban in our green space.
So you would say anywhere in our green space, then we would immediately abate the camp?
If you started a fire. If we came up on you and you had a fire going, I mean, certainly Stephanie Rhodes thinks it's a clear-cut constitutional issue.
We kick you out of your house if your house.
Well, you find them. I mean, what happens, John? What happens if you if you burn a bunch of leaves in the backyard during a burn ban?
Assuming you're fine.
Well, what I understand from the chief again is that you are visited by AFD, who informs you about the fact that a burn ban has occurred, and that it puts in and extinguishes your fire. And then I understand they generally don't find people in the first pass. Because they usually assume that the first pass is education, and then if John is persistently burning leaves in his backyard, then he eventually gets a citation for continued violation of the ordinance.
Yes, Ms. Salazar.
Yeah, I wanted to address the issue Mr. Weldon raised. So the intent isn't to push people, into the lesser use or into the greater use spaces. It may be what happens, but it's also the idea that when the scientifically based model determines that this place is unsafe for people to be there, that could occur, depending on the model. It could occur some places along Chester Creek before it had been cleared out. This is what brought the idea even out. Was I was biking along the Chester Creek and I saw an area that looked like it had been burned, and I said, oh my gosh, what if someone had been asleep or incapacitated in there and then there was a fire? Do we know that there was danger? And I think it's important for us to get people out of those areas, because we're aware that they exist. I feel like from a public health and safety perspective, we need to get people out of dangerous areas. I mean, it may be inconvenient that they go somewhere else, but I think that overall, that's our role in this issue, is to keep people out of harm's way when we know the harm exists. Especially where if we were to not abate the camps and we were to know that this area exists, I mean, the implements of camping, the goods, those would be actual additional fuel for the fire. So I think it's a balancing issue. You know, and I think the point is well taken. I mean, those areas that are kind of less wooded and where camp is maybe more dense are in Felix and I's district, but we want to make sure people can remain safe.
Can I just respond to that?
Go ahead.
I didn't want to say it was your intent for people close to neighborhoods. I said that's the practical impact. And your point about protecting homeless, I appreciate that because it didn't occur to me. I think it's valid.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Thank you, Ms. Solitzel. Any further thoughts or questions on this? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to add a little more to Mr. Dunbar's concern. The section previous being to be related mostly to just moving flower points, not the campsites themselves, except that one section that was sort of retained in paragraph 17, still retained the between the campsites. Immediately, even though it's close to the public, and we do have further up in the campsite living conditions. We have exigent circumstances where it can be maybe 1 hour, but still increased. And the 24-hour notice, which is new for wildfire danger area, not immediate, but 24 hours, we have subject to another usually 10 days. So we still have all that in place that should be I think we're concerned will be. But I think all that campsite will be immediate to going forward, something changes still in place.
Yeah, Ms. Kennedy, do you have a question on?
Yeah, just in terms of the process here. So the intent is to postpone this now?
No, I think we've scaled it back down to a specific ordinance with specific tools that we can implement now. And then there will likely be another ordinance that deals with the fire implements, and we'll continue to explore that. So this pared down ordinance, I think, is ready for a vote on Tuesday, my opinion. Mr. Dunbar.
So the, I know the chief, you had a conversation with the chief and they briefed you, and I don't think anyone from the fire department is here, but did they give you a preview of, have they done this kind of analysis? So they said like, so here are some examples of places we know this summer were these kind of high wildfire danger areas, and where were they, if so?
Well, so my understanding, Chair, is that the current municipality-wide assessment is several years old at this point. And so they're in the process right now, actually, of, because of the earthquake, the funding that's come through as hazardous mitigation funding post-earthquake is going to hopefully enable them by next summer to have an updated version that will look at current levels, the fuel levels, and then create a process for rolling updates of that. So they're operating on a slightly out-of-date document at this point, but the chief could point to certain locations in town, and Russian Jack Park was the one she called out as specifically something that's a clear example.
And interestingly enough, I believe, and the members can correct me if I got this wrong, the chief did point out that MLK was not one of those areas as determined by the model.
Yeah, but, I mean, no, just because it's, no, anyway. Yeah, just because it's high risk doesn't mean it won't grow.
Right. Mr. Peterson.
Not high risk, it won't grow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I'm wondering, has there been a precedent set in another case similar to this, somewhere in another state or another jurisdiction has tried something like this and someone has challenged it? Are we aware of anything like that?
Not to my knowledge. That's a good question. I think we have
I can say I proactively reached out to the ACLU about this, and their primary concerns were some notice and would camping overall be prohibited, and the answer was no, this would just be you can't be here right now due to health and safety concerns. And so far I haven't received any pushback or concerns.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Mr. Weddleton.
Just a quick one. I assume this is true, but it says wildland. So our green belts like Chester Creek, Green Belt, Camel Creek, that's considered wildland. Wildland.
My understanding is that the definition of wildland-urban interface specifically includes things like our green belts, because that is the place where our wildlands hit our urban areas.
So we consider it wildland.
Yeah. by the second.
So looking
Again,
at this.
caveat that I'm the lawyer, not the fire chief.
The statement on trail, so it says develop trail sets. If we just say trails, and because it says for transportation, as long as you're moving along and not camping on it, would that be a little better to develop? We make it easier to try to define what exactly is developed.
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to Dean on where exactly that specific language is used. Maybe to comment on that first.
It's used for our traffic.
Yes.
Did you say that about the trails language in line 22?
Can I delete develop?
I don't see why not. I think the idea was still that the fire chief would want to do a footpath over the wires and trees, but maybe the bike path over the back area down the road. There's people in transit, over to home, they get on, they use area, even though the wooded area is close to the public, and a footpath or trail, wooded area probably isn't, I guess, something that we want to open into non-motorized transportation. I suppose could you be developed, I would recommend it.
And then
From my perspective.
I think Mr. Schutte wants to jump in on this one.
Yeah, through the chair, that definition doesn't exist in code. The various definitions of the types of trails that we have across Anchorage are found in the design criteria manual, chapter 40 trails. In that, there are several different designations of types of trails you could reference if there's a desire to specify the types of trails. So in the example that I believe the author was going for, we're talking Chester Green about, those are paved multi-use paths or trails. But if you're trying to target other types, because there are unpaved multi-use trails also in these areas, it might help to call those out. But I can send the link to the design criteria manual for the drafters, and I can incorporate it to your consideration. One last footnote, what won't be captured because we don't officially recognize them as trails are what we commonly call social trails. And these are just sort of general human paths in our green belts that don't have official status.
Sure, Mr. Wilson.
So initially, you would know, probably 80% of the trails at Bicentennial Park are now are biking trails all over the place. So I mean, we definitely would want to include the Tour of Anchorage Trail. It's a dirt trail, but it's 15 to 30 feet wide. The Hillside Trail is the same, but as you bring it down, I mean, pretty quick, you're going to knock out a huge amount of use. It wouldn't be a real fire issue. Shut down fast run bike, mountain bike. Single track after.
Yeah, so through the chair, I can help with the definition of what the different types of trails are, what you choose to close or not close. But with some context of what the definitions are, you can look at a map and you can see pretty clearly what you're describing, which is there's no paved trails throughout Bicentennial Park, with the exception of the paved path that follows Campbell Airstrip Road. But there's a number of recognized unpaved paths throughout there. So if we're saying that you can declare that area, but those remain open, you might want to consider that because those are unpaved, though they are very large. We want people walking on those during this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Gates?
I would like to add that again, this is the fire chief's exercise, the authority to close areas and for authority to say this trail, develop, whatever, it's going to remain open. So I think that's subject to whatever the definitions are for knowledge to what's going to remain open. I would like to really add to Mr. Dunbar asked about the fire exposure model and to see where it comes and Swin Peterson said that it's real outdated, but we do have several folks weird on fire departments with pages. There's a huge wildfire protection plan that we just need information that's going to be updated that we used to be perhaps or trusted water need after we do.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Gates. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just kind of wanted some clarification on a comment that you made in regard to the MLK fire specifically. And you were saying that if we had had this of the capability, if the chief had the capability of actually implementing this particular ordinance, it wouldn't have applied to that MLK area?
So the current model that we're using right now, which is being updated, my understanding is that the MLK was not in the current model. Would have been considered a wildfire dangerous area.
So I guess then a general question, is that not then problematic in terms of what we're really trying to accomplish?
So my understanding from the chief, and I wish the chief was here, is that it's getting updated. And so that the chief will be able to make much more strategic decisions when the model is updated.
Just to add
Yeah.
to that, my understanding as well about her saying that area was okay now was because the fire had burned all of that brush and everything away.
Okay.
At this point, there wasn't anything else to catch fire, really, so that's why. It's because the fire had cleaned it up at that point.
And can I add? No, never mind, I'm good.
Okay. Yes, Ms. Halton.
Thank you. On that point too, I mean, the scientific model, provides the factors and how it's done. It's not like simply we've done an assessment today and those are the list and then it's static. It's simply we're using this as our tool that is not terribly subjective. It's based on subject matter expertise to evaluate certain criteria to then determine if it's a wildfire in your area. Because again, Becky, Ms. Pearson said, is we don't want the loudest complainer to pressure, we don't want to pressure getting a designation of a wildfire danger area. We want it to be based on the fact that it is likely dangerous due to certain criteria that are likely to cause fire.
Yeah.
I think to the same extent, we don't want it to be so hard to reach the basis of that criteria that we can't use common sense in an area where we think it should otherwise be designated.
And when I originally raised this idea to the chief, she's like, we know those areas.
Okay.
Like, it's kind of this idea that, you keep your grocery list in your head. Mm-hmm. She keeps the high fire danger areas in her head, but now she's going to run it against this criteria. So I think that's important, just to defer to the expert on what she wants to, and wants to rely on, for that criteria. And I'm glad that it's stated criteria and it's a tool so that it's not subjective. We know what we're talking about.
Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit of a nightmare scenario, but it's very similar to what we faced this summer, where we had really high fire danger areas, high fire danger in general. And if the fire chief were to designate a number of these areas, and we were to have our shelter beds be full, would we lose the sort of constitutional ability to abate in other areas? So if those folks, if we said Valley Moon is a fire danger area, and it very well might be, and they said, okay, we're going to the park strip, and they all went down and went to the park strip, which is not a fire danger area, would we constitutionally be able to abate those camps?
I think that's a good question, through the chair. I mean, I think that again, I think that this Martin v. Boise case, I'm sure you're familiar, has this footnote that is the source of a lot of discussion that says basically the lack of shelter in a community should not be interpreted to preclude any type of restrictions on camping. Kind of leaves open this question that some other jurisdictions seem to be interpreting to say basically they have these green light and red light areas within the community where they effectively say, we're not going to abate over here because we don't have anywhere else for you guys to go right now indoors, but we can still move you out of these locations. So I think we would still be able to move people out of high fire danger areas to other areas. Your question is, if they get to those other areas, can we then chase them out of there?
Well, I don't think we necessarily should, but I think it gets to
Yeah.
Mr. Welkin's point is they have a constitutional right to exist.
Yeah,
and if
somewhere.
we're chasing them out of or abating them out of these higher fire danger areas, and those are areas where actually,
No, there's danger.
whether it's Russian Jack Park or what have you, Russian Jack Park in my district, and we've had a number of abatement actions there, but actually we get far fewer complaints from Russian Jack Park than I think you do in your area, because it's a large enough park that folks can kind of be inconspicuous. And if they're out of there, they're going to go somewhere. So.
No, I think you're right that it is an issue to the extent we don't have any available indoor sheltering.
Yeah.
And we are, that impedes legally all of our abatement efforts. I think this effort would still be constitutionally permissible because it's targeted, it's only certain areas of the community and it concerns a designated safety concern. But you're right that I think we would be challenged if we moved people out of these areas to some other area and then we came to abate them there. And unless we develop some other level of sort of red light, green light areas, we would have to have somewhere in town that we would allow them to camp undisturbed if we have no indoor shelter to allow people to head down. So.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Any other questions? Yes, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, a question for Dean. In a previous draft, we had a section about firecrackers, fireworks that APD, I believe, supported. Did we take that part out to further consider it alongside the fire implements because of the constitutional implications of impounding those items?
I'm not sure if I completely understood your question, but the previous version we had looked at for moving paintings and fire fuels and the fire implements here, I wouldn't say it was so much as constitutional implications or concerns as it was practical implementation difficulties, still has not, which was, I guess, for paintings, regarded with constitutional concerns about having first a warning and tracking the person, and the second time, found upsides of paintings with trees and rights together, then we impound and turn it. So I think this process we had in that draft was constitutionally okay, but tracking someone, individuals with a warning and the second violation or violation was going to be really problematic because I guess the typical person you find or don't find see the tanks, but nobody's around because they don't have this county. So forth, there's students very difficult to see how that would be effectively implemented.
Okay, actually I was just mostly referring to the firecracker fireworks piece of it. And we can revisit that when we talk about it, but we had that section in there about...
That's been moved.
Oh, it's in there?
To line 18, 19.
So that was people adding language that was in another part of 2570. There were two sections. One was prohibited acts, municipal land, one was prohibited acts, municipal points, and the firecrackers and explosions and stuff. They were one of those, not the other. We were adding it to the other section as well. So it's not really removed from code. It's in the code in one of those sections.
Well, I may just have too many drafts in front of me. I can follow up with you offline, Dean, but I see the fire implements section contains fireworks in the definition. I was wondering specifically about the impound piece of that, but I think what I heard you say earlier is that'll be addressed later on when we revisit that. And
yeah.
Okay.
We will. And we're considering how to work that in for a future proposal.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Any other questions or thoughts? Again, please get any amendments you have in as soon as possible. With that, we are done. Thank you.